Ukraine allowed Moscow to unload a secret shipment from China and then erased it before sunrise.
"4:13 a.m. A thin layer of frost covered the Kursk frontier as the first ripple of light climbed above the tree line. It came from a single interceptor fired in haste, a sharp rising streak that caught a small Ukrainian drone in the pre-dawn air. The Russians below saw a clean hit, a simple elimination, nothing more than routine. But the moment that drone disappeared, the operation truly began. Hours earlier, commercial satellites had captured something unusual at a remote dock in Nakhodka. Sealed containers stamped with foreign military codes, chassis outlines hidden beneath insulated tarps, and heat traces suggesting newly serviced artillery bound for the Kharkiv sector. Ukraine didn't intervene immediately. It waited, watched, and mapped every movement until the corridor was set. Because sometimes the most decisive strike begins not with fire, but with permission, and what followed would redefine the night. 4:12 a.m. Over the frozen timberline of Russia's Kursk frontier, the first warning arrived from space. High above the atmosphere, a commercial imaging satellite, one of Maxar's newer high-resolution arrays, captured something that should not have existed. In a dim corner of Nakhodka's eastern port, containers marked with Class 7 export codes from the Chinese defense industry were being offloaded under blackout procedures. No cranes, no night floodlights, no visible personnel, just silhouettes moving between metal stacks like shadows rehearsing a secret. The payload inside those containers mattered even more. Not the older systems already known to Western analysts, but PLZ-06 self-propelled artillery units, an upgraded variant with improved recoil dampening and extended barrel life. According to the satellite's heat signatures, at least 9 chassis had been powered up and driven onto transport trucks. The estimated value of the shipment hovered near $80 million, a figure high enough to change the rhythm of an entire front if it ever reached the battlefield. Kiev didn't wait for a second confirmation. Within minutes, Joint Intelligence Command activated a covert tracking protocol known as Spectre Trail. A single Switchblade 320 reconnaissance drone was rerouted from patrol and pushed toward Kursk, maintaining altitude above 6,800 meters while relaying encrypted telemetry bursts every 29 seconds. Its mission was simple. Lines launched a 9M317 interceptor, a thin streak of light that stabbed into the pre-dawn sky. The impact was instant. Corridor the convoy would follow, and that was all Ukraine needed. 4:14 a.m. Along the snow-drenched banks of the Oskil River, Ukraine moved from observation to intervention. Beneath a canopy of frost-laden branches, an upgraded M113 command carrier sat completely still, wrapped in thermal-absorbent mesh that made its silhouette blur into the ground. Inside the dim compartment, green screens flickered as operators reviewed the final telemetry fragments the fallen drone had sent. The coordinates weren't perfect, but they were enough to outline a 19-kilometer corridor the convoy would likely pass through. For those watching this, ask yourself, would you take the shot with incomplete data, knowing you might not get a second chance? The Ukrainian crew answered that question without hesitation. The lead operator armed 24 Gamma-5 FPV scouts, lighter than their frontline drones but agile enough to squeeze between trees at nearly 120 kilometers per hour. One by one, the drones rose silently, climbing just above treetop level before dispersing into the dark like sparks blown from a hidden forge. 2 minutes later, static crawled across the monitors. A Russian Orlan 20 reconnaissance drone swept into the area, its mid-range jamming suite pushing interference into every channel. The images on the M113 screens distorted, then smeared, then fractured into grain. For a brief moment, it looked as if the entire operation would collapse before it even started. So the crew escalated. A single Gamma-5 dipped low and struck a logistical support truck trailing the main column. The detonation wasn't large, but it ruptured an auxiliary fuel tank and forced the convoy to reconfigure its spacing, slowing its movement by almost 30%. That slowdown would become decisive, but Russia didn't remain passive. anti-drone teams activated LPD-802 rifles, dropping 3 Ukrainian FPVs instantly and signaling they had begun a systematic sweep for the source of the intrusion. What they didn't realize was that Ukraine had never intended these drones to strike hard. They were merely setting the stage. Because in the next, the real attack, the one engineered to dismantle the entire convoy, was already rising into the sky. 4:20 a.m., deep inside the narrowest choke point of the Belgorod forest, the real strike began. Inside the M113, the temperature felt colder than the air outside. Every operator knew the previous maneuvers, those small intentional disruptions, had served only one purpose: to slow the convoy enough for the main assault window to align with satellite overhead passes. The clock now matched that window to the second. On the central monitor, a soft pulse blinked green. Authorization granted. 22 Thor-Nine attack drones rose from the tree line in near-perfect silence. Each weighed just under 2.5 kilograms, but carried a precision-shaped penetrator designed to track thermal gradients through dense foliage. Unlike conventional FPVs, they did not form up. They scattered immediately into erratic, corkscrewing paths, movements calculated by the Spectre swarm algorithm, a behavioral model built to dissolve into radar noise. To Russian sensors, they appeared as meaningless environmental flickers. To Ukraine, they were a synchronized blade. The first complication arrived within seconds. A Russian Ka-52M gunship lifted from a forward helipad 20 kilometers away, closing the distance with a cruising speed above 270 kilometers per hour. Its Viker-M missiles and multispectral optics posed a direct threat to the M113, the one asset Ukraine could not afford to lose. The forest trembled faintly as the helicopter approached. The operator reacted without hesitation. A Switchblade 650 loitering munition was launched vertically, climbing to 14,500 feet before transitioning into glide mode. Its thermal seeker struggled at first. The Ka-52M's fuselage radiated multiple overlapping heat sources, but a brief dip in rotor wash revealed a clearer signature: the Switchblade dove. It struck the rear sensor cluster, not detonating violently but crippling the gunship's targeting suite. The Ka-52M veered off course, forced to retreat before risking total system failure. For the first time since the operation began, the air above the convoy was unguarded. That opening was enough. The Thor-Nines dropped altitude as one, spiraling toward the column below. Their telemetry feeds displayed distinct heat outlines. The lead transport vehicle, the 4 PLZ-06 artillery chassis, the fuel carriers, the communication truck, each glowing brighter as the drones locked onto them from above. The final command was executed in complete silence. Swarm drop, and the forest, until then frozen in pre-dawn stillness, braced for impact. 4:23 a.m. The Belgorod forest ignited from within. The first Thor-Nine connected with the lead transport truck, its penetrator punching through a 600-gallon diesel reservoir before triggering a delayed thermal burst. The ignition rolled outward in a low, heavy wave, less an explosion than a pressure shock that turned the tree line into a wall of shimmering heat. The convoy's front section lost cohesion instantly. Drivers braked, swerved, and collided as visibility collapsed into a sheet of orange haze. 2 seconds later, the second drone struck. This time, the target was one of the PLZ-06 artillery chassis riding mid-column. The shaped charge didn't need to rupture the main gun. Instead, it pierced the auxiliary shell compartment, igniting a chain of 155mm rounds stored for rapid reload. The detonation fractured the vehicle's side plating and hurled debris across a radius of more than 40 meters, shredding cables and fuel lines on the adjacent carriers. Then the cascade began. One Thor-Nine after another descended along the convoy's thermal signatures. A fuel transporter at the rear was hit next, and its fragmented tank released a rising column of vapor that ignited in a slow-blooming fire cloud. The heat density spiked so sharply that satellite sensors registered the anomaly in near real time. Within moments, 3 additional PLZ-06 units were engulfed in overlapping combustion zones, each one fed by ruptured hydrocarbon lines. Across the forest floor, the convoy's communications truck took a glancing strike, enough to disable its routing electronics and send a surge rising from metal that had melted only minutes earlier. The Ukrainian M113 rolled back from its concealed position, treads muffled by a thick layer of frost. The crew maintained radio silence as they withdrew along a predetermined route, leaving behind nothing but faint compression tracks in the snow. Every drone involved in the operation had either returned to low-altitude orbit or executed its self-termination routine. No fragments large enough to trace, no circuitry intact enough to decode. The battlefield was erased with meticulous precision. As the sky lightened into a pale winter gradient, the full extent of the impact became visible from orbit. A second satellite pass captured a thermal map showing 24 distinct burn pockets, each marking where fuel, ammunition, or auxiliary equipment had collapsed under rising internal pressure. One of the deeper craters measured nearly 12 meters across, the event as an isolated logistical mishap. But internal assessments painted a different picture, an operation executed with algorithmic precision, one that bypassed traditional defenses and dismantled a multi-million-dollar convoy in under 10 minutes. By sunrise, the Belgorod forest stood silent. Not as a battlefield, but as evidence of a new kind of warfare taking shape in the cold. As daylight finally reached the Belgorod tree line, the battle's last traces faded into a haze. What remained was not simply a destroyed convoy, but the imprint of a strategy shaped by code, prediction models, and the kind of split-second decisions that redefine entire fronts. Ukraine